Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Liverpool.com podcast. I am Dan Morgan. I'm joined by David Lynch and Joel Rabinowitz. You've had Super Leagues, now you've had financial reports, and within that you've also had Liverpool quintessentially doing what has become known as a Liverpool against Newcastle United. And we're going to touch on a few different things, but for all you FSG bods out there, we're going to service you some more with talk of Liverpool's financial reports, which Joel Rabinowitz is absolutely enthralled about. And Joel, I'll come to you first. I want to do this based around the Swiss Ramble, who, if you haven't checked out his Twitter feed, please do, because whenever Liverpool release any financial information, he has really informative threads, one of which he's done this morning, being Wednesday morning, and a quick summary. So Liverpool's profits have swung from 42 million before tax to a 46 million loss year on year. Obviously, the impact of COVID on that is a major result. The main driver is revenue reduction. In revenue reduction was broadcasting, which fell 59 million from 261 million to 220 million. Matchday revenue dropped 13 million. And there's a couple of other things in there as well, which we're going to get onto. But Joel, just your initial thoughts. I mean, a lot of people were dreading these accounts coming out because of COVID and because of the impact. And we have to caveat this with basically saying this was the last 3 months of Liverpool's financial year. So the true hit will probably be felt next year and the year after if they don't qualify for Champions League also. But just your initial thoughts on those numbers and what it could mean going forward.
Yeah, having a read of them, obviously, it's not great news, as we all expected. I think my initial thoughts, I was having a read of it just before we came on here, they haven't done as badly as I thought, or at least in comparison to a lot of the other clubs. I think City come off really badly in there, if you look at that. I'm not quite sure, you and I were discussing this morning, why Chelsea's profit. I think it's because the player sales of players like Hazard and stuff actually come into this one. But Chelsea, for some reason, have a huge profit. But actually, when you compare to most of the league, Liverpool have done quite well, relatively speaking, in the COVID world. I think a few things there. Obviously, a lot of Liverpool's hit that they've taken has been just factors that, like all clubs, is beyond their control, lack of matchday revenue, reduced TV money as well. I think what's interesting looking forward in terms of how it impact them and their plans is the wage bill, because that's gone up quite a lot. I think it was something like a 16 million increase. And I think when we're starting to talk about kind of summer transfer plans, there's a lot of players on quite a lot of money who they're not getting very much, if anything, out of at the moment. And I think players who kind of in previous seasons you would have said are worth kind of having around the squad in terms of squad depth and stuff, but because of how we've seen this season, players like Keita, Oxlade-Chamberlain, there's a few hours knocking around there. I think they're going to have to try really quite hard to kind of shave some significant money off the wage bill this summer. And obviously the other big unknown factor that we still can't say for certain is what's going to be the situation with European football next season, whether that be Champions League, which is looking increasingly unlikely. But there's obviously two other scenarios there. There could be Europa League or the Europa Conference League, which I believe will go to 7th place, or it could be 6th place. It's one of those two in the league this season, which is, to be honest, quite probable, looking at the likely results and the current standings. And that obviously all has a big impact on what kind of squad Liverpool need next season. So I think in terms of what Liverpool can control and what FSG will look to do, I wouldn't be surprised if we see kind of a bit more of a significant a churn of players leaving this summer, or at least if they can try and find buyers, because the wage thing was something that really kind of stood out there, that is gone quite high, and a lot of that is not actually contributing to very much on the pitch.
Dave, Liverpool aren't out of the Champions League running. It's highly unlikely, given the last 2 draws now, that they're going to make 4th. It's somewhat a miracle that they're still even in the conversation, given the form since the turn of the year. We could be feeling the ramifications of this well beyond 12 months. And I think yesterday's numbers and figures reveal that, don't they? I think you've got to take into account that, like I said, this is only sort of really counting the loss of 3 months of 2020, Liverpool really banked on the Champions League as a financial growth over the last couple of years. But without that, and with the obvious hit that's coming, it's going to have to be a tightening of the belt, isn't it, over the coming future?
Yeah, well, I mean, as Joel is right to point out, that in comparison to some other Premier League clubs who've reported for this period, actually what Liverpool's loss is probably not as bad as you might have thought. But the fact that it only accounts for basically 3 months of the pandemic is quite a scary thought, really, in terms of what next season's accounts are going to look like. That takes into account all this season, this period. They're going to be facing some serious losses. I think one thing to note maybe about the wage bill is the fact that a lot of these contracts are incentivised. So what Liverpool will probably argue is that maybe on that side of things, even if they don't get to trim the squad, and they have no doubt they will absolutely try to, but whether they can find buyers in this market is the big question. But even if they don't manage to trim the squad quite as they would like, they should be helped out by the fact that in terms of goal bonuses, finishing position in the Premier League, Champions League progress, that they're not going to be paying out quite as much this time around, I don't think. So that should help things. But still, there's going to be an absolutely humongous gap, isn't there, in terms of match day revenue in particular is the one that in the next set of accounts is going to be pretty horrendous. So that I think this is going to be like you say, it's not just restricted to this period we're looking at now. That's going to have real long-term effects. And I think, going into this summer, a good example of this is, Ibrahim Konate is a player that we all know Liverpool are looking at, and one of the defensive targets that they're considering at the moment. Now, if they are going to buy him, they're going to have to pay out his release clause in a lump sum, because that's how the Red Bull clubs deal with transfers. So that is, looking at these accounts and considering what's going to be happening in the next set of accounts, that is a major consideration. If you don't have Champions League football to pay out somewhere between 35 and 40 million in one lump sum, it's a huge risk. I know, as supporters and everyone watching the club, you want to see that progression, you want to see them improve on this season. But I think without Champions League money, committing to a transfer like that and the way that the club is run, I think is going to be really difficult. It's going to be interesting to see how this whole summer plays out. Can they get more deals done in the way that they did with, say, Jota and Thiago? That sort of very small upfront payments and spread out for as long as possible. They don't have that option with Konate, so it's a difficult one. I think that the impact of this season and this period is going to be felt for a long time. It's going to be difficult for a lot of clubs.
Just to come back to you on that, the incentivised element of it is going to rumble on too, because the incentivised money that's factored into these accounts is probably from the Champions League win in 2019. Yeah. So for the next set, you're going to have the Premier League win.
Yeah,
because that's how it will go on. And again, that's something Liverpool are going to have to fit in. I mean, just to broaden that scope a little bit, I think Joel's right, isn't he? That there's a lot of sort of trimming that needs doing in the squad, and there's a lot of players that Liverpool should really have gotten off the books well over a year ago now. The market, the environment is difficult. It's unpredictable. No one knows really what anyone's worth anymore, and there's going to be a lot of people waiting for other big teams to start the market. I mean, does Liverpool's job become harder in getting those players gone now, or do they have to sort of swallow the reputation as being the team that manages to somehow annually gather £100 million from Bournemouth and just get what they can from the players they need gone?
Yeah, they're going to have to be pragmatic, aren't they? I think last summer it would have been 100% would have been the case that if acceptable offers came in for Shaqiri and Origi, they wouldn't have started the season at Liverpool. The fact that they remained at the club was just on the basis that the offers came in. If any offers came in, they weren't good enough, and no one was in talks about any sort of fees that they would deem acceptable. I think the level you think those fees are now has got to shift. There's been reports this week, hasn't there, that Shaqiri is keen to move on again, and I think player pressure will play a big part this season as well. In sort of, Shaqiri, as much as they'll want to get in a certain fee for him, they've got to balance off the fact that the player's really probably going to want to go and play more regular football elsewhere. So there's that pressure from his side, and also just from the side of they need to raise money themselves to put back into the team. If they do pay that Canate fee, getting that back is an absolute priority, and making sure that money's almost cancelled off and that the books are balanced very directly and obviously in front of them. So it's going to be harder, and they're probably going to have to take some hits on some players, but I don't think you can go into this summer and start talking about 20 million for Harry Wilson and Shea Ojo, for example. I think you really are going to have to consider the position that other clubs are in and what you do in terms of getting wages off the books as much as anything. So yeah, it's going to be difficult decisions for Michael Edwards to make, but ones they've got to make, I think, for the balance of the squad and to keep things moving forward, because I think the biggest thing you've got to guard against is, yes, this is a really difficult period and you've got to be very careful, and nobody wants them sort of taking risks with the future of the club or doing anything silly. But you also, how many more years of Jurgen Klopp have you got? You know, his contract hasn't got that many years ahead of him that you can waste a couple by not giving him a competitive squad. Obviously, loads of things have gone wrong this season that were probably out of the control. But I think you've got to give him, at the start of the season, a squad that can win the biggest honours to start the season with. If they don't do that, then they're just wasting having a manager of that quality, and there's no guarantees that the next one will be at that level. So difficult decisions to make, but they've got to make them. They've got to make sure that they have enough, they have the tools there to win major honours next season.
Just to come in on that, Dan, as well, I think what we're probably going to see now, and we saw a little bit last summer as well, is that they're kind of paying a bit of the price, I think, for some decisions, which I think if they could go back in time, Liverpool, they probably would do something a little bit differently. So I'm thinking things like giving Origi a contract extension off the back of the 18-19 campaign. Well, obviously, he's a hero there, but they probably, at that point, they could have fetched, I reckon, over 30 million maybe for him after the goals he scored and the age he was at. I think, obviously, the market wasn't impacted by a pandemic then, so I think you definitely could have got a reasonable fee. They extended Matip's contract for a while in October of last season, I think it was. And then he ended up getting that injury around with Sheffield United. Man United came and basically didn't play again for the most of that season. And Matip is another player who's just a bit of a problem now, because as we kind of discussed on this podcast before regarding Liverpool's centre-back situation, in an ideal world, you just kind of treat Matip as you just discard him from the conversation, really, because you can't rely on him to be fit when you need him. But as a kind of financial asset, they're still paying him probably over 100 grand a week. And he's got quite a few years left, I think, on his contract. So he's one that's a bit of an issue. Grujic is another one. I remember reading last summer that there's a few German clubs who were sort of, I think it was around 15 to 20 million sort of fee, and Liverpool were looking a little bit more than that. And I think you'd be lucky to get even 10 million, because he's barely even played for Porto this season. And I think that's something that kind of going forward, they just need to kind of take into account of when is the best moment. Kate is an interesting example now, because I think his deal runs out in 2023. But if you give him next season and hope that he just comes good, but it doesn't happen and he has another kind of on-off season, you get to next summer, he's only got 12 months left, you're going to get even less for him. So I think that's one that, they just need to be a little bit more careful, I think, about these sort of decisions in the future.
I'll come back to you in a second on that, Joel. Dave, just the last part of that question that I asked you. I mean, bit of a loaded one, this, but do you think there's any possibility that message is maybe getting sent now across certain players in the squad? You know, we're seeing a reluctance from Jurgen Klopp to use a lot of players on the fringes who many are saying deserve more game time and can impact Liverpool's results positively. I mean, do you think there's any chance that there's a "you have no future here" type of message being sent, or similarly, you know, let's guard them against getting a bad injury again so that we can maybe sell them in the summer going on?
Yeah, I think a lot of his team selections are sort of, you know, he's going with tried and trusted on the basis that he just wanted to sort of try and drag Liverpool over the line in this chase of top four. But I also do think, you know, you can see around his substitutions and reluctance to use certain players that it's almost sending a message of, okay, well, you know, when this summer comes around, you're going to be in a position where you're going to want to sort of push for a move away. You're going to do everything in your power, you know, and through your agents to sound out which clubs might be interested in you, because, you know, you like to think that football managers don't sort of work like that, but there's absolutely no doubt is that they, you know, they want some of these difficult decisions to be made easier for them, and if they can put pressure on the player to sort of make their own way out of the club or ensure that decent offers come in, then that makes things easier for them. So yeah, I actually agree with that. Yeah, I think there is sort of an element of reluctance to use certain players on the basis that he's making quite clear that they will probably not be part of his plans for next season. And if that makes it easier to get them off the wage bill and get a fee in for them, then that's, you know, a double benefit to him.
Joel, I wrote a piece this morning on the site which covered a lot of the wages and transfer fees angle. Now, I basically made the argument that you can break Liverpool's squad down into 3 tiers. You've got the players who should have already left, like I spoke about, the likes of Shaqiri, Origi, and those on loan. You've got the players who will raise an eyebrow: Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain, Naby Keita, Ben Davies, Joel Matip, and the likes. Takumi Minamino threw in there as well, I think. You've then got the top tier. Now, I think personally there's only one player in this tier, realistically, and it's Mohamed Salah. And I think even that is contextualised by having someone be ready, available, and willing to pay the money Liverpool would want for Salah. I don't think they're going to get that for Sadio Mane. I don't think they're going to get Roberto Firmino in the same bracket. So therefore, what's the point in selling them if the money's not there? If that situation became available, does any of this change Liverpool's approach to potentially looking at Salah in a similar situation to maybe Coutinho on the sense of, well, okay, the player could give us what we need financially to take it in a different direction, both on the pitch in terms of transfers, and also he would offset a lot of the costs that we're obviously going to lose and going to need to bring in. And I know fans don't want to hear that, and I know fans don't want to sort of have the football club think like that. But if Liverpool are looking for easy wins as a business, then it's surely something that's got to be on the table.
I think you can make a financial argument that it potentially makes sense in terms of this being, you had 2 years left this summer, Salah. So like I said, with Keita, there's quite a few of them who 2023 is when the deals run out. This is probably the opportune moment in terms of market value with Salah. My argument would be that I see Liverpool being a drastically worse team going into next season. Without Salah, I don't see how they could possibly replace him with anyone near the same caliber. I mean, the guy scored 29 goals this season in a really poor Liverpool team, which hasn't been great at scoring or finishing chances. And his output's actually gone up since last season. It's his second best season in terms of goals for Liverpool, which is just incredible, really, when you think of the circumstances. I think he's the one as well out of the front three who I could sort of see in a sort of Ronaldo, Jamie Vardy-esque manner, just continuing like this for quite a few years into his 30s, because I don't think his pace might diminish as he gets older, but in terms of his movement, his goal-scoring instinct, that stuff is going to kind of remain. And he's such a phenomenon as an athlete as well. He barely ever misses a game. I can see him more so than Mane and Firmino remaining effective deep into his 30s. So I think he's the one I'd sort of build around over the next 2 years. I think in that whole conversation, a lot of it would have to come down to kind of him and his agent, I suppose, if this hypothetical scenario were to unfold and there was kind of genuine interest from a club. It's how hard Salah would push and how disruptive Klopp saw. I think that's ultimately what it came down to with Coutinho, was that Klopp kind of weighed up the benefits of keeping him and decided that kind of for squad harmony purposes, he didn't want to keep a player against his own wishes. I think if we were to move into this summer and a club, and I'm not quite sure which club this is actually, because the two Spanish clubs without the Super League money, Real Madrid and Barcelona, are in huge, massive mountains of debt, basically. I don't know how they stump up the money. There's maybe a PSG argument, but there's not a huge pool there that I could see. I think where if there was an offer and Salah and his agent were to push really hard and it would kind of become a bit of a toxic situation, then maybe there is a bit of a more of an argument. But just, especially the manager Klopp is, he doesn't want to keep players who don't want to be there and don't feel like they're part of it, then perhaps. But as it is, we can't say whether that would actually happen. And for the reasons I stated, I think he's one that I think regardless you have to press ahead with and plan around for next season and beyond.
Where I'd put him, sorry Dave, where I'd put him to you is top of a list of 3 of Liverpool's most saleable assets this summer. And that's where I think you can't rule it out. Because I think if you ask yourself what are Liverpool's top 3 saleable, or who are Liverpool's top 3 saleable assets this summer, I would say it's Mohamed Salah, Fabinho and Alisson Becker. I don't think you can put Van Dijk in the conversation because of the injury. I think Sadio Mane's form means he stays at Liverpool. And I think that Trent Alexander-Arnold's whole England thing takes that out of the equation, plus the local element of that too. So I think if you had those three lined up and you said, really, in terms of importance, who the Liverpool want to keep, you could make a really good argument that they need to keep Fabinho and Alisson and Salah. But if they were to sell one, Salah could be the one who you arguably are able to sort of replace in terms of attackers who you feel could give you a similar output, maybe whether that's split between two or three that you bring in, I don't know.
I think this comes back to what Joel touched on earlier about some of the previous summers where some difficult decisions weren't taken. And I think Liverpool have sort of put themselves in they've dug a bit of a hole for themselves in not taking some of those difficult decisions. So, for example, around the time, like you say, Origi could have been sold for vast sums, relative to his value. If they make that call then and then getting someone who they think is more of a long-term successor to that front three, maybe a little younger than Jota was when he comes in this summer. He's more ready to make that step, but just a little bit younger, who they can sort of groom to become part of that. Because with not making that decision, also maybe, not signing anyone in the summer after they won the Champions League, which is obviously a very difficult decision to criticise on the basis that they went on and won the league so convincingly. But I think the chickens are coming home to roost a little bit on having made those decisions now, in the sense that, you hear reports that Salah's people don't feel that Liverpool are quite as enthusiastic in terms of offering him a new contract now. And I think that's because they recognise what you say, Dan, that possibly he could be the key to rebuilding this team. Now, they shouldn't possibly be in that position, but what has happened is obviously the pandemic's come and that's completely out of their control. But Sadio Mane and Firmino have seemed to hit a wall at exactly the same time. And now they're completely reliant on Salah. He's the only one of that front three who's seemingly, regular source of goals this season. So you leave yourself in a position there where you need a rebuild, and money is now tight, and finding how you raise that money. You can't sell Origi for what you could have sold him for after Liverpool win the Champions League. So it's a really difficult situation they're in, and I just think the way things are played out now, it's almost impossible to make the case for selling Salah to raise funds in a Coutinho-esque attempt to sort of rebuild the team, because I just think he's so important, and you leave yourself with Firmino and Mane who might recover slightly next season. If you give yourself another forward option to replace Salah, that might help things, but it's just very difficult to see Liverpool challenging for top honours without Salah as part of the side next season. And that, the fact he's 2 years out from the end of his contract, this is a summer where you have to make a decision on him, and it's just a difficult one. And I think a lot of it comes back to having not made some big decisions in the summers previous. And while that's hard to criticise, given what's actually taken place and the trophies they've won, it's something that Michael Edwards and the recruitment staff are sort of paying for now, and it's difficult.
I think Joel's completely right as well. The buyer isn't there, and that's the other thing. In that, no one could have foreseen what was going to happen, but Liverpool are not operating in that market of, Neymar to PSG, which they could have, massively maximised a sale like Mohamed Salah if they wanted to. I don't see where he goes, to be honest. I'm not sure anyone of a top standing at Liverpool would have the buyer available to them that Liverpool will be willing to sell to. So on that, we'll take matters away from off pitch and move them on. And Dave, I want to touch on your Fabinho piece that you wrote for Liverpool.com this week, which was in many senses pouring out of frustration I could feel when a sub-edited it. The move to centre-back over the last two games has been one which, you described yourself as quite baffling, and one in which is quite frustrating to get your head around when, as you rightly point out, Pep Lijnders, goes to the press and gives an interview in which he basically laments the loss of Fabinho to Liverpool's midfield this season and what they've lost from him playing centre-back. I guess I'm asking, are you surprised that they've not looked at Reece Williams, Ben Davies for these games, and do you see this sort of being a Nat Phillips or nothing situation now going forward?
I think it speaks to the idea that, and this sort of goes under the radar a little bit, that Jurgen Klopp is quite a conservative manager at heart. You know, I know he's famed for all this attacking football and forward thinking and pressing high up the pitch, but he is quite conservative, and you see that a lot of the times in his selections. And I think as soon as Nat Phillips drops out, I think he wants that comfort blanket of Fabinho back there. He thinks that is a stronger back four unit than maybe using Reece Williams or taking a chance on Ben Davies, because obviously that would be his Premier League debut, and throwing him in is difficult. But I think you saw in both games as soon as he did that, is that Liverpool didn't have a lot of control in midfield in either of them. And while your back four might be slightly stronger to have Fabinho back in there, it's constantly getting runners coming at it straight from midfield, and you know, with very little protection in front. And I think, you know, I just think the only positives out of this calendar year in terms of Liverpool performances has been when Fabinho has been in central midfield, and I think he's proven that he's so crucial that, you know, it was a difficult decision when Klopp went with Phillips there alongside Kabak, because I think he's never really fancied Phillips. He's shown that throughout most of the season. So he's done it begrudgingly because he wanted to get Fabinho back in midfield. Now, the idea that he just threw that out as soon as Phillips got injured just seems sort of bizarre to me, and I think he's paid the price. I think that's cost Liverpool the chance to finish in the top four. And it's difficult now if Phillips isn't fit for the weekend against Manchester United, although he quite probably will be, given he's been doing individual sessions since the start of the week. So it's very possible that he will be. But if he isn't, then throwing Ben Davies or Reece Williams in now becomes an impossibility, doesn't it? Because you don't want to put either of them up against, you know, likes of Rashford or Bruno Fernandes. So it's a bit of a nightmare situation. They could have been blooded and eased into it in the last two games, and they would have had that great protection in front of them of Fabinho, and now that opportunity's been missed. And I think those are the two results that you'd say would have put Liverpool out of top four contention. So a decision I think Jurgen Klopp will probably regret. And I think going into next season, obviously you hope there won't be even the need to play Fabinho at centre-half at any point. But I think even if there is, I don't think he's going to go down that route. He's for me the best holding midfielder, or probably top three holding midfielders in the world, and he needs to be in that position because it makes your defence far better. Even if it's good enough to not need that protection, he is so good at it. And I think he should never be moved from that position.
Do you see sort of how Jurgen Klopp has felt tactically backed into a corner on this, Joel? I mean, you've got, in many ways, you've got a bit of a perfect storm with Phillips on the pitch, because Liverpool's high line has been referenced again in recent games. And I think you can see when teams try to play over the top of a Nat Phillips, he's able to win the first ball. And if you've someone like Fabinho operating in that area in front of him, then you can put your odds in favour of Liverpool winning the second ball, I should say. I can see where that works, and I can see an argument where it doesn't work in Jurgen Klopp's head when one of the three of Phillips, Kabak and Fabinho was taken out of the equation. It's just who you then replace them with. I mean, I'll read the Pep Linders quotes that Dave put in his piece. That's where we lost our engine. That's the biggest problem. It's something that created doubt in many different tactical aspects. We didn't lose only our last line. Before that, we didn't lose only our last line due to injuries. By losing our last line, we lost our midfield as well. I think you can see the argument. The obvious square pegs in round holes thing that Liverpool have been doing all season means that once you take him out of that midfield area, it does look a bit disjointed without someone who can operate that area in front of the back four, and especially the two centre-backs in the way that he can.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about Phillips and the fact that we've madly got ourselves into a situation where Phillips somehow feels like one of Liverpool's most important players if they can get him fit, in terms of how the team plays and everything, is that you go back to earlier in the season, Phillips wasn't really even in the conversation when they had the first few injuries to kind of Van Dijk and Gomez. Reece Williams was playing the more games. He played in the 2-1 win at home against Tottenham. In the League Cup against Lincoln, I think it was Reece Williams, and against Arsenal as well. Phillips was kind of well behind in the pecking order at that point. So whether Klopp kind of got to a point with Williams because of his age, was quite an age gap between him and Phillips, and he thought, well, it's just not fair on his own development to keep putting him in the spotlight when he's not ready. I know he kind of had a few rough games, Reece Williams, where his kind of was it the Villa game I think he played in the FA Cup, and he got skinned for the goal. And I think it got to a point where it just felt almost a bit unfair to keep playing him. But I do agree with Dave in that the last 2 games do feel like a bit of a lost opportunity now, because I think it is almost impossible going to United away to just chuck one of him or Ben Davies in. It just feels unreasonable. But then I do feel like the structure and the balance of a team net is just so much worse without Fabinho there. And the numbers are there to back it up. I was having a look the other day, and I think Dave mentioned it in the piece as well. I think they've started 9 games with Fabinho at centre-back this calendar year, and the only win was against Villa's Kids in the FA Cup. The rest of them they've drawn and lost. And I think it's 6 with Fabinho in midfield, of which they've won 4 and kept 4 clean sheets. And the only defeat was against Real Madrid away, which obviously they were poor, but it's a tough fixture. And I think for me, one of the most frustrating aspects as well that you lose when you put Fabinho to centre-back is that you get a much worse and less effective version of Thiago there. And we saw kind of a few games either side of a March international break when we finally got Thiago alongside Fabinho in midfield. He was a completely different player. The second leg against Leipzig, Wolves away, Arsenal as well. I thought all of those games, Thiago looked more comfortable than he has done really at any other point, with Fabinho kind of doing more of a defensive legwork behind him. And I was surprised when they kind of got to the Real Madrid, both legs really, and Thiago obviously comes on for Keita in the first leg. But I know I've seen that's being used almost as a stick to beat Thiago with, and kind of how was he not selected? But I think that was Klopp's error. And I think not seeing that partnership between Fabinho and Thiago given the chance to kind of flourish has been a real kind of frustration over the last few games. As well, we've seen Klopp, he clearly wants to try the 4-man front line, as we've seen kind of within games, the second half against Arsenal where it worked well, hasn't worked so well recently. But I think a lot of that comes down to you can't really play 4 up front without having Fabinho or Henderson as part of that 2-man midfield. It just doesn't work. And then opposition teams just play through Liverpool too quickly. And I mean, I suppose why it's difficult to analyse as well is we wouldn't even be having this conversation if the forwards had just put the ball in the back of a net and they'd seen those games out. We're talking about the Fabinho thing because they drew and it was 2 late equalisers. So if they'd just held on for 1-0 or they'd scored the goal they should have done, then we could just say, well, he moved Fabinho back there and it was fine and it all worked out. But I do agree. It's definitely something that next season they really need to try and kind of, as a non-negotiable, have him in that midfield because, I think it served a purpose for the kind of the first half of this season, and I understood why that was Klopp's first move when the injuries happened. But I think as time's gone on, it's become increasingly clear that it doesn't help Liverpool overall.
Joel, and the other player you mentioned there, you've had a busy week on the Thiago Alcantara, no assists.
Yeah,
train, haven't you?
I have, yeah. I mean, we won't go into the particular Twitter conversation, but there's been several people over the past few months, commentators, pundits, and everything, kind of voicing similar-ish sort of narratives around Thiago. Then the lack of assists being one of them, but also the idea that he slows Liverpool down or he's not a good fit for the way that Liverpool play. And yeah, it's frustrating because I don't think any of us would sit here honestly and say that he's had the impact that we all hoped and expected he'd have when you go back to kind of last September when they announced the signing. And we were all saying that he was kind of the player who was going to take a 99-point team up a level and add something extra on top of a team that was already almost perfect and was winning pretty much every week. That was the plan. He was going to play in midfield. I think as we saw in the derby, that's probably what Klopp's midfield plan for this season was going to be. Fabinho sitting deep, Thiago and Henderson on either side, and then probably Curtis and Wijnaldum coming in on the occasional game. But we've just not seen that at all. And what is kind of I've found frustrating in the whole conversation is that all the kind of the circumstances around his season and all the factors that he's had to kind of contend with have just been swept aside as if they just don't matter because he's a world-class player and he should be playing better. The fact is, he came, I think he had less than a month after the Champions League final with Bayern, who didn't really have a pre-season, arrived at Liverpool, obviously kind of tired from the previous season, had no time to get up to speed. He then gets COVID, 2 weeks gone that he should be kind of getting up to speed, integrating. Then he misses 2 months of a really horrible knee injury from the derby. By the time he comes back, he's not got any match fitness. He's coming into a team which has already started to lose its way. Instead of playing next to Fabinho and Henderson, he's playing in front of them because they're playing at centre-back. The system's all out of place. and he's had to play kind of 2 or 3 different roles within the midfield to try and plug gaps. So he's ended up just doing a completely different job to what we bought him for. And I would argue he's broadly done okay, I think, as well as he's not played as much. He's not played as well, I think, as we would have ideally wanted on a kind of prolonged basis over several months. But I think there's been enough examples recently, the games that I mentioned, Leipzig, Arsenal, Wolves. There's been a few other ones. I think he was good against West Ham and Spurs away back in January as well. I think there's more than enough there. And if you look into the stats, he's coming out on top on a huge amount of kind of underlying metrics in the Liverpool squad and in the league. I think there's no reason really to believe that next season, with a full pre-season and in a better Liverpool team, hopefully, we'll see a lot more from him. But the idea that he's somehow been a problem or a failure, I just don't buy.
How we judge him, Dave, is one thing. I mean, how Jurgen Klopp judges him will ultimately be the most important. I think Joel covers it quite well there in terms of a lot of things, but most importantly, he's playing in a situation that he wasn't bought to play in. You know, he was seen as an additional sort of lockpicker for Liverpool, a team that was rightly given itself the mantle of a winning team based on the previous 2 years. We just have to take a bit of a breath here, don't we? And I think if you are Jurgen Klopp, then I think he's absolutely fine with what he's had from Thiago, and he'll be hoping that, you know, he can sort of put the real plan into place next season now, because this season obviously has just gone from sort of one bad turn to the next.
Yeah, I think all those mitigating factors I think will be massive considerations for the manager, but equally, you know, he will also hope there's more to come. I think, you know, there's been some really bright performances in there that are worth mentioning. Like Joel listed a few off there where you can just remember him have a genuine and positive impact on the team and showing what his level of talent. He got man of the match actually against Newcastle from Steve McManaman on BT, didn't he, over the weekend, which just before Liverpool conceded the 2 injury time equalisers. So he obviously played well in that game as well, and I thought one pass, wasn't there, in particular, he pinged into, I think, was it Mo Salah's feet for a layoff to Jota that was just a real sort of indication of his quality. Like that's exactly what you want to see more of from him. But I think, you know, along with all that and the mitigating factors, I think the manager will want more from him going forward. He'll hope next season, coming into a more stable team, that he can show a bit more, because, you know, as much as things have gone against him at times, and I understand what the tactical plan was against Real Madrid, I can't imagine that Thiago will have been happy to have missed starting both of those games. You know, this is a guy who was instrumental in the Champions League win last season, being told that, okay, as good as you are, you don't fit the tactical plan for these games. That, you know, no player will be happy with that, especially a player of his quality. So I think there's a lot more to come, and Liverpool will just hope that, you know, having a bit more solidity in that midfield around him, because I do think you have to, as good as he is, I think you do have to cover for certain weaknesses about it. You know, he can be turned quite easily, or more easily than Liverpool midfielders that we're used to. You know, Wijnaldum, Fabinho, Henderson has been that solid midfield, hasn't it? So they're so capable of, you know, getting about the pitch. They're slightly more mobile than Thiago is. He's more sort of front foot pressing rather than sort of knowing there's gaps behind him. He's maybe less aware on that front, but he makes up for that by being out of this world on the ball in comparison to those three. So I think Klopp will hope that once he gets that solidity back there and he gets a starting midfield that is Fabinho and Henderson alongside him, that will sort of mitigate for some of those weaknesses, and then you'll just get to see all that brilliant quality that he can bring, and that will be the thing that kicks Liverpool onto the next level. So, you know, maybe you see a slightly different approach in Liverpool next season because of that, because he can be that influential. He can really change the way they play. So I think, you know, this can't be held against him this season, and I'm quite excited to see what he's like when everything's sort of working and the team's back at it.
I think we still need to sort of find out what player he is and what player he's becoming. I think it's no coincidence that he plays against Newcastle in what is essentially a 4-2-4 from Liverpool. Liverpool knew they were coming up against a 5-4-1 with Newcastle. There was going to be no surprises. It was a 6-4-0 at times, but they knew they were coming up against a really deep lying bank of 6, bank of 5, whatever you want to call it, with Shelvey dropping in. And they needed players ahead of Thiago. They needed players ahead of the midfielders that they had in there. At times, Liverpool, it was almost a 2-4-4, if depending on where you put the fullbacks and who was in and out of possession. that's where I think going forward, and that's where I think Liverpool getting their air of superiority back will really benefit him, because you make a really good point about the Madrid game, Dave, and the fact that he wasn't selected. I think you can argue that if you're Jurgen Klopp, it's a difficult conversation, but it's one in which you can say, well, this really isn't a game that suits your strengths in the sense of what we need. And I think Liverpool getting more of Thiago's strengths on the pitch and then getting him on the pitch by virtue of that is going to be where we see the best of him, and we can stop having silly conversations about whether he's got an assist, because, you know, there's a really basic point here that if Trent Alexander-Arnold would have scored a wonderful volley on Saturday, he'd have had an assist. And what did he do? I think he clipped the ball in the air outside the edge of the area, square, side.
And also the fact that he never has provided very many assists.
And that's what he wasn't brought in to do,
He got 2 assists last season for Bayern Munich, at which point almost everyone regarded him as one of the best players in the world. I think his average is something like 2.5 if you go over his entire career at Bayern Munich. So he never has delivered huge numbers. I think that's where a lot of the criticism has come from. And I think some of it has been justified. Obviously, it is annoying seeing him repeatedly fly into tackles and give away fouls in dangerous positions, and it has cost Liverpool on a few occasions this season. But I think a lot of the there's been quite a big misconception about the player. A lot of people who necessarily only saw him in the Champions League, who didn't watch Bayern Munich on a regular basis, assumed that he was just this maestro who would come in and play the final defence-splitting pass that is as an assist for a goal. What he does, the pass that Dave mentions there, the one in the first half against Newcastle, is exactly what he's always done. He's the pass before the pass, or even the pass before the pass that then creates the chance. He's a player who, in the kind of initial phase of the build-up play, or less so in the final third, I think is moving Liverpool from the middle third to the final third is what he was primarily brought in to do. And I think the numbers and the eye tests generally do bear that out. He does move the ball quickly and accurately in a way which is different. That pass there is one I think almost all of Liverpool's other central midfielders, with the possible exception of Keita when he's on form, none of them really will play that pass because they'll look to go to one of the fullbacks or go backwards and recycle. Thiago does it quite often, and it's the technique he has where it's difficult for opposition teams to predict, because something about his body shape where it's very difficult to tell him to the last moment that he's going to just fire it between players. But when he does that, it just moves Liverpool so quickly from one phase to another. And I think, we mentioned they're playing alongside Henderson and Fabinho, but I also think playing in front of a defence that includes Van Dijk, possibly Konate, maybe Joe Gomez if he's fit as well. I think all of that makes a big difference to what kind of Thiago we'll see next season.
All right. A massive thanks to Dave and to Joel. That's been this week's Liverpool.com podcast. We'll be back next week with the Manchester United result, hopefully in the bag in a positive sense. But until then, we'll see you all soon, and take care. Look after yourselves.